Hi everybody, welcome to week 11. 11. Okay. Let us have a look at what we've got here. All right, so I'll be giving you back your annotated articles and proposals over the week, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you've done for those. There's no face-to-face class next week. Okay, I'm not here. So it will be an online class for both sections. So you just look at week 12 and you'll find a written lecture under week 12 instead of a link to a spoken lecture for those of you that are out there. And in here, you just don't come. And if we can remind Sandy, well, she'll probably be watching this, so that's okay. I hope you all got a chance to see the lecture from the State Department. We were all in here, I know. And do send me an email if you have any questions after you've watched the video that the State Department people gave to us, which we've sent you the link for. Let me know if you have any questions after that. All right, so what we're going to talk about today is essentially the conventionalization of discourse. So it's the idea of not having to reinvent the wheel every time we engage in a language activity that we've engaged in before. So you can think about it very simply as things like greetings, right? We don't try and come up with a new greeting every time we see anyone. We use the same conventionalized formula, right? But obviously there are some things that we want to say that are new to a given situation, right? We want to impart new information. So what we're constantly doing is merging sort of the understood, so conventional patterns and repetitions, with the new thing that we want to say, right? And we often have a barrier between those. If you think about something like, you know, you come in and you say, hey, how you doing? Good, you, good. Then you might use some kind of marker like so, or right, or well, or non-verbal marker. And what that marker does is split up, okay, we did the conventionalized routine, to now I'm about to present something new, right? And I may present that as conventionalized, or it may be unconventionalized material, right? So we can use the example of intonation to talk about this. For example, you have a speaker and a hearer. So you have a given speaker and a given hearer. And the information that we assume they know that they have in common is in this Venn diagram right there, right? So that assume that we know would include, if they were from the same speech community, any idiomatic uses of intonation. So what might an idiomatic use of intonation be? Think of how you give a phone number. How do you idiomatically recite a phone number?
101.
Yeah. 334, right? 903-406-3346, right? Now that's for English, right? And if you do it a different way, like 9034-256136, everybody says, what are you doing, right? So, but of course, if you're from a different speech community, you may well not share that idiom. So how do you guys say phone numbers?
In France, they say it in twos.
Ah, so give us a, for instance.
0456.
Ah, okay, okay. And then,
We say 2 3s. Like the beginning, the first part, we say 2 and then 3 and then 2.
Yeah.
It's like we have 8, I guess.
okay,
Yeah. So
Okay.
it's like
yeah, different.
2 3 3. Yeah.
We have the code, it's 2 digits, and then the number is 33.
Oh, 3, 3, right, same. Okay, okay. So that's just one idea of an idiomatic contour, right, that you produce. Another one is something that we call a calling contour, which is when you say, Johnny, come on, dinner, right? That's called a calling contour. That's another idiomatic contour. Now, I don't know if that's shared across new varieties of English. Is it?
In not really.
Do you have a calling contour?
Just calling the person with
Yep.
the name.
But do you have an intonation pattern that goes with that?
No.
Oh, okay. So we have this idiomatic intonation pattern. So again, if I'm with the same speech community, I expect that to be shared. Also shared within here is any information that I share with the speaker and the hearer share in terms of real life, right? Cultural information, information about the world. And then either side, there's this other information that maybe the speaker is trying to give to the hearer that the speaker assumes the hearer does not know, right? So at that point, the speaker has to choose which interactive patterns in the moment to use to communicate the message, right? So that's the difference between assuming that there's some, what they call in here, lingual memories that we have in common, and then assuming that there's some information that we're going to have to produce in the moment, okay, that could come in any different way. So one way that we build this kind of sort of symbiosis between what we know and what we're building that's new is called intertextuality. It's basically text building on text. And of course, I now need Shihan, and he now isn't here. Nana, can you just pop your head out and so the example of intertextuality I'm going to show you actually is a little children's book. It's yeah, I need the thing. It's a little children's book called Princess Bubble, and it was actually written by one of my students. Okay, perfect. Is that gonna work? Let me see. It was written by one of my students at Georgia State University, who, that's what I'm trying to do, who was an airline attendant for Delta, hence the reason that it was in Georgia. And she and her friend were often furloughed off of Delta, which is basically means that you don't exactly lose your job, but they don't know when you're. So every time she was furloughed, she would take another graduate class in linguistics to try and move herself forward in linguistics. And this Princess Bubble, so this is my student Kim, she wrote with her friend, and I don't know how well you can see the text. Can you read the text? Yeah. So, oh. There, how's that? So this is Princess Bubble. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful, blissful princess named Princess Bubble. So what's the text that what's the script that we're using here?
Storytelling. Storytelling.
Yeah, storytelling, more specifically.
Narrative.
Yeah, more specifically.
Oh, idiomatic intonation.
You're trying too hard. What is this? What does it look like?
It's like
It's children's what? Children's
Literature.
fairy tale, right? Yeah, it's like, what's it based off of?
Yeah.
What's it based off of?
Fairy tale, princess story.
Yeah, Princess Cinderella, Snow White, you know, all those, right?
Fictional.
Yeah, so the script that they're using here is essentially a script of fairy tale. So we immediately recognize that it's a fairy tale, right? Or, you know, it's being textualized as a fairy tale. And here goes Princess Bubble. Princess Bubble graduated from Royal University and took a job for the Royal Hairline. Ready for adventure. So this is where Princess Bubble is working. She decides to buy a place of her own, and the other princesses come to her house. Okay, so far we're still several of her friends, Princess Twinkle, Princess Sparkle, Princess Glitter. What are we doing there?
Repetition.
Yeah, right. Some repetition and alliteration, right? Had found their princes, and they were soon to be married in a royal wedding. And Princess Bubble and Princess Swan were asked to be bridesmaids. Okay. So Princess Bubble hosts parties in her new house so they can begin their happily ever after. And then these married princesses frequently ask Princess Bubble, why hasn't a beautiful princess like you found a prince? And Princess Bubble says, but I'm happy. I'm traveling, making friends and helping others. But she's princeless. Okay, so now we're beginning to get the intertextuality part because we're moving away from what's happening now in this story. Is it still following the script of a... Right, so now we're beginning not to follow the script of a fairy tale, right? The one that we expect, yeah. So suddenly the queen said, it's time for you to find a prince. Okay, so she had many different options. And she decided the queen was right, so she went to dinners, movies, parties, and football games with lots of different princes. She joined www.findyourprince.com, and she even kissed a frog. So here we're going, you can see what we're doing. We're going in and around and that's why you're laughing, right? Or at least Mimi is laughing because, you know, yet the fairy tale says she must find her prince, right? So she reread fairy tales, The Little Mermaid and Snow White, to find out. But she soon realized that unlike other princesses, she wasn't trapped in a dungeon. Right? She didn't have a wicked stepsister or a stepmother. She didn't know any dwarfs. And she didn't live under the sea. But the most confusing part was she was already happy, right? So what are we doing now with this fairy tale?
We're using the old information, like the old fairy tale.
Right. If you didn't know the old fairy tale story, this wouldn't make any sense, right? So this is the classic idea of intertextuality. You have to know one thing in order for the other thing to make perfect sense. I mean, obviously, it's a story and you can read it as a story. It makes, you know, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But in order to do the job the text is designed to do, you need to understand the other side that's not here, right? So the fairy godmother comes and says, living happily is not about finding a prince. True happiness is being kind to others, enjoying others, being helpful. Princess Bubble was shocked that all the fairy tales were wrong. Everything that said the fairy godmother said made perfect sense. So here goes Princess Bubble looking at all her great adventures and her friends. She has dogs, of course, and she helps her grandmother, and she does all these things. So she knew that she would live happily ever after being her flight attendant self. And she did, without her prince. The end, right? So that is a classic example of intertextuality where the full sort of idea of the text is within the two, the two texts that are being worked on there. So what was the idea of that? Do you like Princess Bubble?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I like the little feminist undertone.
Yeah. So the idea of Princess Bubble is to, within the tradition that we know young girls are brought up in, to show that, as Mimi says, you can have some feminist undertones. I really thought this was a clever little book, and and as I say, a great example of intertextuality. Am I changing the input, Sheehan? Click desktop. Ah, yay, great. All right. Okay, the next thing your book talks about is appropriation. And appropriation can be viewed as both positive and negative, right? What did she say appropriation was? What's the definition of appropriation? Do you remember? Let's see if we can find it in your book. Just did intertextuality.
It's 182.
182. Thank you very much. So, to describe the process by which texts and discursive practices take up bits of prior texts is the notion of appropriation. Okay? People learn how to do things within the context of daily learning. They must start to borrow things. And by borrowing things, you end up appropriating those things for yourself, right? So these could be things that you borrow in a moment, from one another, in a particular situational setting, minute by minute, or it might be something that you borrow wholesale from somebody else and you use all the time, right? In language learning, a positive view of appropriation is when you see language learners using language resources in a way that works for them, as opposed to in a native speaker way, right? So I've got a couple of examples here, and I want you to tell, first of all, this is something that doesn't work very well when native speakers non-native speakers are talking to native speakers, because native speakers tend to correct them, right? But if non-native speakers are talking to other non-native speakers, in this case of English, we're calling it English as a lingua franca or ELF, then we know that these kinds of principles apply. The first one is called, and I think we've talked about this before, the first one is called the let it pass principle, in which the hearer lets an unknown or unclear action pass, meaning that either it will come back and they'll have a chance of understanding it again, or it won't be that important and they can move on without it, right? Now, of course, this can get you into trouble too, right? Particularly if you're an intermediate learner. A lot of intermediate learners do this thing where they say, aha, 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 and then before they know it, they're in trouble. But that tends to happen with native speakers rather than non-native speakers. And interactional robustness is this idea that, again, if it's to non-native speakers, they're using English as a resource to communicate with each other. Thus, the communication part is more important than the sort of typical linguistic behavior part. Okay, if you can communicate your message in that moment in some way, you can appropriate together whatever resources you need, linguistic resources you need in order to do that. Okay, so I keep thinking I'm getting to the example, but let me give you this example. Have a listen to this and tell me what's happening. Okay. Oh, sorry. This is an example of one of those spot the difference tasks. So the speaker and the hearer are on opposite sides, and they both have a similar picture, and they have to decide which parts of the picture are the same and which parts are different. So it's a picture of a room with various things inside the room, and they have to decide the 10 differences between their two rooms, right?
You said, excuse me, you see the lamp and a tree?
Yeah, small tree.
A small tree.
Inside the room.
Inside, okay.
How about your window?
Okay. So can you guess what's going on there?
She said, do you say, and then she corrected herself, you see the lamp, right? Or,
Mm-hmm.
right? Instead of saying, do you see? So do you
Right,
say,
right,
and
that's
here,
good.
excuse me, you see the lamp. Self-correction.
What do you think is going on here?
Repetition.
Yeah.
Like checking if that's what he or she said.
Right, because what's a tree mean? What's a tree? A big thing outside there, right? So this isn't a tree.
Right.
It's inside a room. So what is it probably?
It's a picture.
Mm-mm.
There's like abnormalities.
You said it, I think. A plant.
Oh,
Yeah, it's a plant, right? But she doesn't know the vocabulary word plant. So the guy says a small tree. She says inside a room, and he's like, oh, right, okay. She means a plant. And in fact, it is. It's a picture of a plant in a pot, plant pot, right? So instead of saying, oh, you mean a plant, right? Or, yes, I have a plant, or whatever. He just says, as soon as he understands that by a small tree, she means a plant, and inside, he knows he's also got a plant inside, so he's fine, right? So that's not the difference between them. So have a listen again.
You said, excuse me, you see the lamp and a tree?
Yeah, small tree.
A small tree.
Inside the room.
Inside, okay.
How about your window?
Okay. So this is called convergence on a linguistics code, right? So convergence on unique forms that are coined within that particular interaction, okay? So again, it can be big, or like it can span a lot of time and a lot of text, or it can be very small. In this case, it was very small, right? It was one, and then they moved on to another part of the picture, right? But basically what it means is a reduced use of idiomatic phrases, formulas, anything that's not literal or transparent, right? And the way you can do that is by saying, I'm not going to assign any idiomatic meaning to anything. I'm going to say, by a small tree, she doesn't mean a tree. She means a plant, right? Because I have a plant too, right? Here's another example. Tell me what's going on with this one.
See, this car don't have the.
I should tell you what's happening. In this case, the two people are looking at cars, pictures of cars, and they have to decide which car they like best. There's 10 pictures of 10 cars, and at the end of their discussion of each of the 10 cars, as a couple, they have to choose one of those cars, right? These are two Chinese English speakers.
See, this car don't have the upper cover.
Upper cover. You mean the ceiling is not convertible?
Yeah,
Okay.
it doesn't have the ceiling.
No, this car is convertible, so you can have you do have the ceilings. This is a convertible car.
Forget about that.
This was actually our experience. Most of the different gendered pairs didn't do well when it came to discussing cars. Yeah, like the two women together did okay and two men together did okay, but when it was a man and a woman, they had different ideas of what was important about a car. So okay, so what's happening here? What's the coined term that gets repeated?
Ceiling.
Ceiling, right? Okay, so it's clear that A sort of understands that it's not a ceiling, right? She's trying to come up with the word that you have for that, so she calls it an upper cover, right? And he doesn't know what an upper cover, what the word is either for the roof of the car, so he calls it a ceiling, and she decides, sure, we'll go with ceiling, right? So now everybody knows what's going on. She doesn't care whether it has a ceiling or not, that's the root, but everybody understands what's happening, right? Let's have another listen to that one.
See, this car don't have the upper cover.
Upper cover. You mean the ceiling is not convertible?
Yeah,
Okay.
it doesn't have the ceiling.
No, this car is convertible, so you can have you do have the ceilings. This is a convertible car.
Forget about that.
I just love this. I love this one so much because she's like, no, it does have a ceiling. Like, I know what's going on with this car. Yeah. And she's like, who cares whether it has a ceiling or not, right? So that's an example of the idea of interactional robustness, right? Not let it pass. They do work it out together, okay? In both cases, they work it out, right? In both cases, they work it out by relying on convergence on a linguistic form that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with with correct native speaker linguistic form. It just functions for the that part of the interaction. So that's a positive side of appropriation, right? Meaning that you're appropriating English and then you're taking any resources that you can to make that appropriation work. You're not sitting there saying, oh God, we need a bilingual dictionary to find out what's the name of a upper cover of a convertible car, right? Because as long as you both understand, you can move on. But there's also negative examples of appropriation, right? And there was one in your book on page 183. Do you remember this example? So this example was between a Korean speaker and I think Japanese. No, but they're talking in English. But so what's Chaz? Ken is Korean American. Oh, Chaz is African American, right? But has learned some Korean, right? And then Ken is Korean American, right? So Chaz is trying to appropriate what? What is he trying to appropriate?
Say some words in Korean, like
Yeah.
using some.
What sort of words? I mean, nice words.
Oh no.
No,
I
right?
just saw that.
So yeah, so it's an offensive term in Korean, right? And he seems to think that Ken will be happy that he's got some Korean, but in fact, what is Ken happy?
He's offended.
Yeah, he's offended, right? He's like, yeah, no. So you have a look at the discussion on page 184. Chaz's behavior indicates he thinks his use of the derogatory term will align him with Ken and share this attitude about Vietnamese people, but Ken's behavior shows that his appropriation of the Korean words and Korean ideas has failed, right? So in other words, there's good appropriation and bad appropriation, right? So you can do it, it can work or it can't work. The one that's really interesting right now, excuse me, and I was reminded of this yesterday, watching the TV, is this 23andMe. Who's heard about this 23andMe? No one's heard of 23andMe? Oh, I love my non-native speaker classes. 23andMe is the new thing. And it is, you get your blood tested and you send it off to the 23andMe company and you find out who, yes, your ancestry,
It's like
right?
Ancestry. Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, well, no, Ancestry.com, it does it with writing and whatever. Yeah, no, 23andMe, you do it, it's actually your blood or your swab or whatever, so it's your genetic makeup. It's not your, it's like what you genetically are. Right, yeah, your DNA. Right. Not what your,
I have to pay for it or it's free?
Like
yeah,
Yes.
$70.
yeah, how much?
70.
Did you have it done?
I've watched some video on YouTube.
Ah, right. Yeah. So this is now the big thing. And in fact, 23andMe are already advertising on TV and other places to get people to buy this for Christmas, right? To buy it. So, you know, you can buy it for your sister or your brother or your family or whatever to get yourself, this is your Christmas present. Find out what you're genetically made of, right? But there's an ongoing problem with this, which is fascinating, particularly in this country. And I'm hoping this will actually, yeah, here we go. So this is in fact an article that you can read. I'm not going to go through the whole article with you. But the problem is that now all of a sudden someone does the 23andMe and finds out that they're Native American, like they're 55% Native American. So now all of a sudden they think they're Native American, right? Or they find out all kinds of things. So marginalized, so you can see this, your newfound ancestry is not your golden ticket into communities of color, right? Do not think you can understand the inherent struggle of marginalized communities because an online test told you that you could, right? So here let me scroll down a little bit. So I don't know how many times I've had to listen to a white person tell me they found out they're 5% sub-Saharan African, like this is some kind of exciting news to me. This doesn't make us kinfolk. So this is becoming a real problem with because the other thing that it's becoming so of course people that are marginalized, you know, say it's not enough to want to embrace the fun and worthy aspects. You have to have all the struggle and the pain that came with it, right? So yeah, so it's a sweet little, you know, it's worth reading to get an idea of what some of these problems are with 23andMe. But it's also happening because, you know, you can get scholarships and things if you're African American or if you're Native American. So, you know, how much Native American do you have to be, or, you know, to say I'm now Native American, right? So it's the idea of appropriation, and in this case, it's turning out to be, you know, quite problematic. Yeah. So you want to be careful with your appropriation. And again, there's another idea that's similar, which is recontextualization, which is taking something and then recontextualizing it elsewhere, right? So we might call it taking something out of context, right? And we obviously know that that's problematic because people will take something and then you'll say, wait, that's now been taken completely out of context. So again, that is what we mean by recontextualization. And again, it can be both useful and harmful, right? Depending upon how it's used. So a harmful example in your book was on page 185 of legal discourse, where there was a discussion. If you haven't read it properly yet, you should, but it's a discussion basically of excited utterance and how a woman who did not want to prosecute her husband or did not want to give evidence against her husband had her own words used against her because she came out of the house shouting something, and then those shouted words were allowed into court, right? Regardless of whether she wanted them to be. In fact, she didn't want them to be. So in that case, it was kind of a harmful recontextualization inside the legal system. But it can also be useful, and one of my favorites is this example. So have you guys heard about Falling Water, the house Falling Water? It's a gorgeous, gorgeous house. And if you ever get a chance to see it, you should. And it was built by Frank Lloyd Wright, who you may or may not have heard of. Famous, very famous architect, really famous. Again, if you want to contextualize this, you can look all this up later. But Falling Water, the building of the house caused quite a lot of problems between and it's now one of the most famous houses in America. It's absolutely stunning. It's a house that's built on top of a waterfall. So the waterfall actually is in the bottom of the house, and then the house, yeah, it's an astonishing thing to see. Huh?
Actually, the picture of the house and the picture of Frank Lloyd is in a textbook that I was teaching.
Yes, yes, that's Falling Water. Yeah, it's really famous. So if you go to page 186, this is a letter from Frank Lloyd Wright. You know, things were going badly with the contract between them. Dear Mr. Kaufman, I don't know what kind of architect you are familiar with, but it apparently isn't the kind I think I am. You seem not to know how to treat a decent one. I have put so much more into this house than you or any other client has a right to expect. That if I didn't have your confidence, that if I haven't your confidence, to hell with the whole thing, Frank Lloyd Wright. Now look at Mr. Kaufman's response. I don't know what kind of clients you are familiar with, but apparently they are not the kind I think I am. You seem not to know how to treat a decent man. I have put so much confidence and enthusiasm behind this whole project in my limited way to help for the fulfillment of your effort that if I do not have your confidence in the matter, to hell with the whole thing.
Oh, so nice.
So why is that clever?
So you just use repetition.
Yeah. He just recontextualized his own words right back at him. right?
The best comeback.
Yeah, it's awesome, right? I wish I could have thought of something like that. So in that case, it was kind of useful. And if Frank Lloyd Wright had any sense of humor, you know, if he got that, he would say, okay, I need to stop being a prima donna, right? Then there was some discussion about repetition using formulaic and pre-pattern speech. So again, we're coming back all this time to how you use prior discourses, how you conventionalize, how you shortcut people's understanding, basically, to make it easier. So again, it's a form of language convergence, right? You're converging on something between the speaker and the hearer. You can either repeat a word or structure from earlier in the discourse or use formulaic or pre-patterned speech. So repeating a word from earlier in the discourse is what we saw here, right? That they agreed on a term. They converged together on a term, right? But your book doesn't talk about this, but you might want to think about this. What's the difference between that and mimicry? What do you understand by mimicry?
Or it has the undertone of mockery almost.
Right. Good. That's exactly correct. So there's a difference, and she didn't discuss it, but it's important. There's an important difference between repetition and mimicry that is then perceived as a negative form of teasing or ridicule, right? And we can do both. But if your repetition is perceived as mimicry, then you're going to be in trouble, right? So mimicry can be something that we share against somebody else. Unfortunately, I can't find the sound file for this at all, but this is something called stylized voice. All my examples are from intonation and speech, but it's all the same thing. You know, obviously speech anyway with mimicry. This is a Russian speaker saying, the dean told us the same thing, like, no, I'm sorry, guys. I know sometimes it's too late. It's because your lecture started at 8 p.m. So that's stylized voice. The stylized voice is the Russian speaker pretending that she's the dean of the school, right? And that, in that case, that's fine. You know, the dean, by the way, is a woman of the school. So that's, I happen to know that dean. And she probably did sound something like that. But then there's also absolute pitch matching, which is perceived as being ridicule or something mean, right? So in this case, the example is a radio show. Again, I sadly don't have the sound file. The caller is calling in an answer to a question, and the host of the radio show has to say, you know, they got it right or they got it wrong. And in this case, she says, it's up here. She says, is it spring? And he says, is it spring? No. Okay. And that's the, is it spring? Is it spring? No. Okay. What you see on the top is the absolute pitch matching. What you see on the bottom is where it should have been. Okay. So that's in fact the difference between the normal pitches, right? But what he does is put their pitches exactly together. So it sounds like ridicule, right? Because his voice should be all the way down, but instead he lifts it so it matches the exact same register. So whenever you think about repetition, you want to also be aware of thinking about the negative side in terms of mimicry. Okay, so I think probably one of the last things that she talks about is identifying linguistic registers, styles, and genres. Now, I have just whacked them all together. If you were in stylistics, if this was a stylistics class, I would not be able to say registers, styles, and genres as though they were all the same thing, right? In the kind of work that we're doing right now, looking at the BIBA stuff in your book and looking at the kind of lexicon syntactic patterning examples that I've got for you, it's really essentially the same thing, right? A register has certain features, or a style has certain features that always happen, and a genre is a collection of those features. You recognize a genre because it has these register features, right? And those features can be either linguistic or situational. So in a case like academic genre, you have both, right? There are certain linguistic features that mark something as a white paper or as a journal article. And then there are also situational things about where you would find it and where you would expect to discuss it and so on. So we're just sort of lumping all that together with the caveat that, you know, if you wanted to do more on this, you would have to think through some of the differences. But again, there's a focus on repetition. If you look at page 194, figure 6.1, this is Doug Biber's idea of how you identify situational repetition, right? How does something look like it's the same thing? How do you recognize it as being the same thing as the previous instantiation of that thing? Okay, so he says, for example, you identify these 7 issues. And if you can identify these 7 issues as similar, then what you've got is a situational register that's similar to another situational register, okay? So communicative characteristics, relations between addressor and addressee, like status and power, so setting, channel, relation, etc. So what you can do, this is how come you can create similarities between a register, a situational register like a teacher in a classroom and students, and a situational register like a doctor and a patient, right? Because the situational register carries some similarities in terms of someone's got the power and someone doesn't, right? So anytime that you have that kind of power relation, that can help you identify some of these similarities in situations. And then from there, what Doug Biber does is, in all his work on variation in speech and writing, is say what linguistic features go with those situational features, right? And that's the idea of doing variation analysis in discourse. So again, at the bottom of it, even though it's called variation analysis, at the bottom of it is recognizing what's the same, what's repeated over and over again, that helps you to understand that this is this kind of discourse and it fits with your other prior discourse experiences in this area, right? Does this make sense? Mm-hmm. So we've looked already at academic discourse, but we can look, for example, at lexical patterning. This is something that Doug Biber and other corpus linguists do a lot, right? So a pattern is a repeated word or repeated sets of words that if you go into a large corpus, so a corpus of texts, be it written or spoken, you can find repeated many times, okay? Or repeated by many speakers or writers. So some examples of that are given here. Some single word formulas, thanks, okay. 2-word collocates. If you find help, you often find people with that collocate. Multi-word sets in the something place. Completion, I don't want to, multi-word sets. So these multi-word sets are also sometimes called what? Does anyone know? Bundles, word bundles or lexical bundles. So basically what you can do is use a corpus thing like Doug Biber's to identify what the most popular 4-word bundles are, or 3-word bundles are, or up to 7-word bundles people have looked at. And then if you're a teacher, for example, you can use those to help you design what it is you should be looking at to help your learners both read and write academic writing, right? If a lot of academic writing comprises 4-word bundles or 7-word bundles, you can teach, instead of teaching your learners one individual word at a time, you can teach them a chunk or a bundle. Now, the bundle, as we'll see in a second, might not necessarily make any sense per se, but it's always that bundle of words that appears over and over again, and then you add something new to it. We'll have a look at that in a second. So multi-word idioms, give someone a run for her money, their money, our money, technical terms, or what's called phrase frames. And these phrase frames are one of the really interesting set of bundles that come up in academia. Particularly in speaking. So what we did, me and Pat Bird some years ago, was have a look for lexical bundles in my case, which is the Michigan Corpus of Spoken English Lectures. And we were having a look to see if we could identify word bundles so we could help students listen to lectures. So we had a look at all my case, and what we found was 48 4-word lexical bundles that occur at least 10 times per million words, and that's considered to be a sort of baseline important thing. If it turns up a lot less than that, then you're not sort of worried about your bundle. And these were the bundles that we found. This is from an Intro to Biology text. This was the bundle that we found a lot of people, if you look at in the or something like that, the rest of the, and to be able to. So these 4-word bundles appeared over and over and over again, and then you could attach something to it. The only one that really sort of or something like that is a nice one. You can teach that, but it's interesting that there was a lot of repetition of, random words. Yeah, that was just a random repetition. Here's another one. A lot of the, at the end of, if you look at the end of the rest of the, so these are what we were trying to show to students as sort of important bundles that they might hear over and over again, because when you hear them, they sound very different from when you read them, right? So a little bit of is going to sound like something like, I'm not an American, none of us are American, a little better, yeah, a little better is what it's going to sound like. So if you've got somebody that's just sort of, walked in off of a language classroom in Korea or China or whatever, they stand no chance of understanding a little better, right? But they're going to hear it quite a lot when they're listening to spontaneous spoken. Same with a lot of the, right? So these are some of the things that we did with lexical bundles in terms of teaching and repetition. Now in writing, there's tons of them. And if you get a good textbook, a good writing textbook, it will prioritize some of the lexical bundles that have been found. If you are interested in this at all, you want to look at the Academic Spoken Word List by Avril Coxhead. It's called the Academic Spoken Word List, and she's done a lot of work in what words and what bundles appear over and over again for learners. There's also a nice example I've got here of tonal repetition. Okay, so I'm going to play this without comment, and you can tell me what you think is going on.
I went to trip to Florida. Yeah, when I was in a high school senior with all my classmates and the teachers. Yeah, we went to Orlando and Miami and all the parks of Disney. Yeah, it was very funny, and we were there like 12 days. Yeah, it was the first time that all of us were outside home with our parents. Yes.
What's going on there? What's she doing over and over again? Yeah, he's going, ah, do you know what that's called? That's called HRT, a high rising tone. It sounds like a disease, and for many people it is a disease. You can think of, I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of Valley Girl English, but that's that. Yeah, well, no, vocal fry is the opposite. But Valley Girl English is the idea of, you know, going up at the end of at the end of, which a lot of people find particularly annoying and disturbing. Yeah. Well, this girl, I mean, was awesome. She was from South America somewhere, and she was in trouble because she was not coming to her ELI, English Language Institute classes, and so I was head at the time, so she was told she had to come and see me, and you know, I was supposed to tell her off, which I did, but I was more fascinated by the fact that she had picked this up, because it turned out that she, instead of going to her classes in the ELI, she was going to the mall. And she was hanging out in the mall, and I was certain that this is where she was getting this from these other kids in the mall, because there's nothing in her first language transfer that should have made this happen. So after I told her off, I was like, I've totally got to record you. So I don't think the telling off went well, but so you can have another listen and you'll hear it.
I went to trip to Florida. Yeah, when I was in a high school senior with all my classmates and the teachers. Yeah, we went to Orlando and Miami and all the parks of Disney. Yeah, it was very funny, and we were there like 12 days. Yeah, it was the first time that all of us were outside home with our parents. Yes.
She's so awesome. So one of the things that those of you that have taken sound systems with me or are taking it with me now, I think there's a couple of people that are taking it with me now. One of the things that we say in intonation is it doesn't matter necessarily exactly what tone choices you pick. I mean, sometimes it does, obviously, but one thing that we do is vary our tone choices. And as soon as you hear something like this, you realize that we vary our tone choices all the time, because there's something about this that says there's something totally wrong with this, right? Good. All right, well, I think that's it for today. Yeah, so any questions or comments or questions about the chapter? Okay, so based on the reading that you did for this week, which I strongly suggest you go back and relook at now we've gone through some of the important parts of that, and the PowerPoint, describe a genre or register that you are familiar with and others may not be. What repeated patterns, behavioral and linguistic can you identify? Okay, so have a think about it. It doesn't have to be particularly dramatic genre or register, but it may be one that the rest of us are, as I say, not familiar with. Yeah.
Can I talk about the Valley Girl and how they talk?
You can, but are you familiar with it?
I used to watch a lot of the Kardashians.
Sure, you can use the Kardashians. Yeah, the Kardashians are, but they also have vocal fry, don't they now? Yeah. So vocal fry is the new, that kind of thing. Yeah. No, pick something else that's more something that you might be familiar with. That it could be a professional register that we're not familiar with. It could be a familial register that we're not familiar with, like, family conversations in your culture may go differently than, it could be anything. It could be the kinds of repeated patterns that you find if you go shopping that are different between cultures and languages. Really, you don't need to try too hard. Think of anything that basically is a linguistic and cultural experience that has repeated patterns. And then think about what those repeated patterns are and what's critical about those repeated patterns. Like, is it the use of honorific pronouns? Is it the use of certain intonations? Is it the use of certain lexical syntactic patterns? You really just want to think about what it is that is special about that. Could be a number of things.
So you use Viber's thing to check it.
Yeah, you can use Viber's thing to confirm, but again, don't make it too hard. The idea is not that you turn this into a paper. The idea is that you really try and think of what your personal experience with registers or genres might be. That, like, for example, if you pick academic teaching, okay, that's okay, but we all know what academic teaching looks like. To some degree, we all know what repeated patterns. So for example, if you picked teaching with children, a repeated pattern might be IRFs, right? Initiation, response, feedback, right? It's less common with adults, but it also happens with it. But that's a repeated pattern inside the classroom usually, right? And there are other repeated behaviors for children, especially. Sitting down for circle time at the beginning of the day, and or even things like checking names off a register and how you do that. So just think of a situation like that we might not necessarily be familiar with, and just try and think through what repeated patterns so it can be repeated behavioral patterns, but I also want some big repeated linguistic patterns to go with it. Yeah, not just behavioral patterns.
From my second data analysis, I saw one pattern with outer circle English speakers.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they use, with their back channels, they use like in triples. Like, they'll say yeah, or okay.
Oh.
So could that?
Yeah, within conversation, you mean within a conversational event? Yeah, I'm not sure how often native inner circle speakers do that. I don't know whether that's a particular thing for.
It just stood out for me because when I actually transcribed it, I saw a lot of it in there.
Yeah, well, and again, well, you want to be careful, and I don't know the answer to this, but you want to be careful because basically as soon as you start transcribing, you see lots of things that you never see. But if you transcribed to Native American speakers of US English, you'd have to decide if that was, you know, different. But that's fine. You can do that if you can come up with some more behavioral. I mean, basically, you're looking at a register that you can come up with behavioral and linguistics, more than one, preferably, features that are different. Yeah. I mean, if it was in conversation, for example, you might have a difference between, well, so pauses and turn taking, right, for example. So I don't know if there was anything in your registers about that. You don't have to come up with data for this. You just have to think through something that you recognize as being different. Yeah. Yeah. Say that again.
I have to think deep because I
you have to
about something cultural. Like,
yeah.
where do we have like a lot of like pattern repetition, like meaningful repetition?
Tons of places. Yeah.
And how
Discourse. Yeah. Text. Discourse and text is about, you know, all about, you know. Another thing that you might want to do is, as I say, go back and reread this chapter. She has tons and tons of examples from all different sorts of places. So, but essentially the way we communicate is by taking as many shortcuts as humanly possible, right? So if we can repeat a pattern, or be that a linguistic pattern or behavioral pattern, we will repeat it, right? Because it's easier than coming up with something new. So just try. You don't have to think about it right now. You have a whole week to think about what one might be, and have a reread back through the book as well, because that will help you with this chapter too. Any other questions? All right. So you're also, and everyone outside, you're also waiting for me to get back to you with your proposal, and which I will do as soon as I possibly can. And there's no face-to-face lecture next week. Okay, so let's make sure that we remember to tell Sandy and Roosty. Yeah, because there's also no lab meeting next week. So maybe I should send out an email to them. Sure. All right, Dara, you are done. Thank you.